Good afternoon, everyone. I think we'll get started now. Welcome. I'm Nina Sachdev, the Director of Communications for Media Impact Funders. Welcome to this session on climate catalysts. Media Impact Funders is a network of funders who support media in the public interest. Today we'll be talking with funders on how they're approaching media and journalism around the climate crisis, where they see challenges, where they see progress, and their approaches to intervening. First, I just want to give a quick thanks to IJF and the organizers because panels like this are very important. Any opportunity that we have to peel back the curtain a little bit about how philanthropy works, how funders make decisions, makes everyone's work better. So thank you, IJF, for this. So today we will be spending the first part of this panel hearing from our funders. Each of them will talk for a few minutes about their approaches, their theories of change, their whys, and how they and their organizations are intervening. And then hopefully around 12:30, we'll get to your questions. This is a unique opportunity to hear from funders, ask funders your questions. So I am going to step out of the way and let you ask your pressing questions. So now I'd like to introduce our panelists. To my immediate right is Mitali Mukherjee, Director of Journalist Programs at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. And in the middle, we have Robert K. Elder, President and CEO of the Outrider Foundation, and Marina Pravdic, Director of Operations of Communications, Policy, and Advocacy for the Rockefeller Foundation. So, Mitali, why don't you start and share Reuters' theory of change and what you're working on and why?
Thank you, Nina. Hi, and great to see a full room for subjects other than AI. Welcome, everyone. Just want to also say that I think I'm sort of representing a dual role over here, which is that we don't give out funding. We are the beneficiaries of two extremely strong funders who've supported us in our work. But I think what's important in terms of what we do is to explain and put out to the world the importance of a platform, the impact at a granular level for journalists, and what we're doing with newsrooms per se around climate. So this is just a whistle tour of what we do. The Oxford Climate Journalism Network is a part of the Reuters Institute of Journalism. We're at the University of Oxford. And the program really was born as a product of the need that we felt really existed across newsrooms to report on climate. And I think what I want to underline before anything else is we're not about training journalists, because what we found is that journalists know how to do their job very well. What they're lacking is a syntax to put climate into their reportage. What they're lacking is access to accurate data. What they're lacking is sometimes the ability to use that language to interpret data in a way that they can responsibly report forward to a larger public. So here's what we do at the OCJN. There's sort of 4 building blocks to our work. We run an online-only platform where we take in 100 journalists in every cohort. It was a conscious decision to go online because we felt that was the only way we could democratize the process. What's happening very often is that journalists only coming from a particular geography have access both to information, data, research, and even a space to talk. Very proud to say that we've now worked with 400 journalists who speak more than 100 languages. We see that as a very big win indeed. We're also split equally in terms of gender, and for lack of a better term, we have a much greater weightage to the global south rather than global north. That's one part of what we do. We also do in-person fellowships for outstanding journalists from across the world, where they come into Oxford, they stay there for a period of 6 months, and they work on a project that speaks to a climate challenge that is personal to them, but also reflects off a larger challenge for the journalistic industry. So we've had journalists from India, from Bangladesh, from Brazil, all speaking about challenges that affect journalism at large, but their communities too. The third pocket, and we think this is a really, really important area, is that we work with newsroom leaders. We understand that sometimes the journalist gets it, but by the time it moves up the chain and to the news editor, something gets diluted and it's not as important a story, and we want to change that because we're not here to tell you that climate is one journalist or one beat or one desk. It is literally a lens, and I don't tire of saying this, it is literally a lens that you can attach to any story that you do. Just look at the World Cup reportage. For the first time, we actually saw a lot of climate input going into what they were talking about. That's the fourth one. And the fifth one is research. It's sort of, it's our badge of honor at Reuters. We do a lot of work around journalism and research. And we found that there was a big gap while talking to what climate news means for audiences, why it's important, what kind of news they're looking for, and within that, who they trust. Hint, hint, it's not politicians. So that's really the four parts of the work that we do. I can move forward with this, hopefully. That's a snapshot, very briefly, of the kind of subjects that we cover. We try to do a lot of the big items, whether it's biodiversity, whether it's, all of it, as you can see, climate justice. But I just wanted to say that we are also very mindful of picking up topics that are quite here and now for journalists. So at this point, we're sort of trying to conduct more intimate fireside chats with many of our journalists around elections, for example. We understand it's a sensitive issue in many countries. It's not just about reporting on the what and why of elections. In many countries, it is quite fraught with danger, which is why we want to create those spaces to talk. We have most recently talked about climate and conflict. And we think that's really emerging to become a very, very big challenge for journalists to talk about the climate damage that is occurring even as areas of conflict crop up across the world. And finally, this is just a snapshot of the kind of organizations we've worked with. Small, big, we've really, really worked hard to have representation across categories, across platforms, trying to talk to journalists from every field and really supporting them, I think, in terms of what they can do best while talking about climate. It's the little wins that matter. One of our journalists who works with FOLA in Brazil recently interviewed the Brazilian finance minister. The headline, even though the conversation was about business, was that Brazil will continue to exploit all its oil assets till it needs the money. And I think that's such a beautiful mix of where climate meets every other story, and these are the wins that we're here to celebrate and support. Let me pause there.
Thank you, Mitali. I want to ask you a question about the badge of honor, the research component of Reuters. Based on your work, how are you and how should news organizations think about news avoidance? You know, with the climate crisis, there's a mix of optimism, but also a lot of people do feel hopeless and helpless. What are some insights you can share about news avoidance?
Not scrolling Twitter, just checking my notes. So our research shows a couple of things. I think the first thing is that just as we're seeing across news, the news organizations across the world are struggling to reach out to younger audiences. They are generally tilted towards an older audience, which tends to consume more news. They generally also tend to lean left in terms of political leanings. This is all a function of what we see by way of news consumption as a whole, and that's happening with climate as well. Having said that, over the last 2 years that we've been sort of conducting this research, we've found that there is an increasing reporting back of engaging with climate news. And I think there's a bunch of things happening there. One, hopefully, the dial is moving and news organizations are making more of an attempt to integrate climate into their reportage. Two, the fact that extreme weather events are now much, much more, clustered. You're seeing them more often, and people are being impacted in terms of loss to life and damage in a far greater fashion. So people are engaging with climate news because they do want to know a bit more about what's happening. That's one in terms of the engagement. The important bit for me and for all of us really is the fact that because climate tends to become it's a spectrum. So you have people who really understand this and engage with it. At the other end, you have people who think it's complete hokey pokey, including some who are standing for elections in some countries. So it's really important for us to sort of, emphasize that trust lies, and this is across the 2 years and across the countries that we work in, which is 8 countries, trust lies paramount with climate scientists. Those are the people that people turn to for more expert opinion. Those are the people that they want to talk to. Right at the bottom of the chain is politicians and political parties. Journalists come somewhere in the middle, which is not a great place to be, but it's not an awful place to be. So I think trust is something that you need to double down on. And really engagement, as you said, Nina, it's really important to go out and engage with audiences where they are. I'm really looking forward to hearing more about different platforms and what they're doing through the course of this festival. But I think that's the big one. You can't expect young audiences to walk to where you used to consume your news from. You have to go to where they are, and you have to be talking about climate in a way that they can relate to. Final point, solutions journalism, and I'm not sure how many in the room are sort of familiar with that term. It's useful. It does work. People are looking for stories that give them hope, not just stories that bring them down and make them feel, worse about life.
Thank you. I think that's a good lead into the Outrider Foundation, which is funding climate content across a variety of platforms. Robert K. Elder, take it away.
Thank you so much. How do I work this?
The green button is to go. The red button is to go back. This one is to shine a spotlight on yourself,
Okay.
yeah.
All right, can everybody hear me okay? No? My microphone is not on. No? Push. Oh. I wasn't here for rehearsal.
Always need a journalist to fix things.
So thank all of you for being here. Again, my name is Robert K. Elder. I'm the president and CEO of Outrider Foundation. We are a private operating foundation, and the way we sort of support this journalism is through fellowships. We have a twin mandate, so we support journalism and multimedia storytelling on nuclear threats, and in fact we have a panel tomorrow you can catch on that if you're interested, and climate change. And so in the fine cinematic tradition of show, don't tell, I just thought I would show you some of the things that we have helped support. So we have, where am I?
I think towards the screen.
Okay. So we have fellows, and I'll change the graphics here in a minute, but we have fellows at the New York Times, Time Magazine, Inside Climate News, Science Friday, Bloomberg Green. We have a couple of other fellowships coming up. Oh, here we go. And we also support sort of networks at a variety of size. So not just with accountability issues and rural issues, but also solutions journalism and science. And our most recent fellow is Inside Climate News. Her name is Noelle Smith, and she's a Navajo journalist, a Native American in the US, in the Southwest, reporting on the impact of climate change on reservations and Native populations, which we thought was underreported. So here's an example of our first round of fellowships. We teamed up with Bloomberg Green, and this is one of the stories they did. You know those Amazon packages that they say, oh, recycle, just recycle these and it'll be fine. Well, Bloomberg Green tracked those packages back to India where they were burned, not recycled at all. The good news about this story is once the province in India that this was happening found out, once this was published, they outlawed the practice. So it's an example, again, we talk about not a theory of change in journalism, a blueprint of change in journalism. We have seen journalism change the world. But not technology. Where am I? Okay, there we go. This is also Bloomberg Green, and this is about China's abandoned electronic vehicles. And you can Google all this, it's all outside their paywall, and the video that goes with this is amazing. It's sort of the hidden cost of electronic vehicles. Rio de Janeiro's toxic ship graveyard. This is also Bloomberg Green. And then Inside Climate News, I talked about Noelle Smith's amazing work. She's done a bunch of work about tribal lands, and also, interestingly, this back and forth, this place where climate and nuclear meet. So it's been a few months, but it's been pretty amazing. Oh, thank you. Wow. Oh, it works. This is Justin Warland. He is our fellow at Time Magazine, talking about John Kerry's new sort of climate works, trying to leave government and work with the private sector. And I just wanted to show you a few of our fellows. In fact, is Rasha here? No? No, she couldn't get in the room. That's how popular this was. I said hello to her outside, but Rasha is at Science Friday, and Bill Hennigan from the New York Times is with us here as well. So our approach is very much a hands-off approach. We believe that independent journalism is important. So we have people come to us, and it's usually institutions come to us. We don't choose who they hire. We have no control over editorial content. We just want to make sure that they're shining a light on these very important issues. We have usually 4 to 5 slots a year, and we're 2 years into doing this. This is only my 2nd year as CEO. And I think I will be most useful answering your questions afterward.
Well, you can be useful now by answering my question. Rob, I wonder if you could unpack impact assessment a little bit. How are you thinking about impact? Did every one of these stories that you showed lead to a change? And then also, how should newsrooms think about impact?
So from a funder perspective, it's very important that you're on the same page with your partners. So you're measuring the same thing. So for us, it's not only important that large groups of people see it, but on which platforms that are engaged, because especially the generation behind us. I know there's a lot of there's less debate now. I think the Yale University just had a study that said 72% of Americans believe in climate change. So that is less and less of an issue, and the generation behind us is just going to have no patience for it at all. They're going to be, okay, what is the solution? How do we get ahead of this? And probably be pretty resentful for again, the generation ahead of them. So we think about not only how many people see it, how it sparks conversation. If real change happens, that is great. I met CC at the Markup, which is a technology news agency in New York, and she has this amazing metric. She's like, change or it didn't happen. That's a really high bar, because sometimes you cannot measure change that happens immediately. Sometimes it sparks conversation. We also keep track of very carefully when the journalism we support ends up in the mouths of politicians. So that's one of the ways we track it. So it's not necessarily how many people read it. Again, page views are important, but also which communities are seeing it. If it's underserved, if it's solutions oriented. So it's different for every partner, but it's just it's important that you're on the same page with that partner.
Thank you. Marina, let's turn to you. What's happening at the Rockefeller Foundation aside from a lot?
Good question, and I'm here to answer it. So I represent the Rockefeller Foundation. We, in September, made a very historic commitment to align all our programmatic investments along climate change, and this is something we've never done before. And we're going to be doing it in 4 programmatic areas. So it'll be public health, food, energy and power, and then the innovative financial systems that are necessary to direct funds to increase resilience in those communities that are already and will be most affected by climate change in the future. So I'm here to tell you a little bit about how we think about sort of climate action influence and what my Department of Communications Policy and Advocacy is thinking about as we advance these programmatic initiatives that we're working on. So go to the next slide. Okay. So our challenge, this is not the, here we go. Why now? So our challenge is great. actually, I just was looking at this little girl in the audience, and she reminded me of my daughter, who is almost 6, and she keeps telling me not to litter because the earth is burning. And she's not totally wrong, so it's getting really hard to comfort her. So this is why we're doing this. So the problem is that, as we know, there isn't enough climate action, and we're failing at it. We know that if we meet all the investments that are being committed right now by the private sector, the governments, and others, we're still not on a path to a truly livable world. We have, according to research, about 7 years before we surpass that sort of safe 1.5 Celsius degree. So things are not great. And then we as a foundation figured that because we've been around for 111 years this May, we can help with our sort of institutional voice and legacy and reputation to really focus on those solutions that lift up the vulnerable communities who are most affected by this. And many of them already have solutions to this issue, but the world might not know about it. So the challenge is great and multifaceted. Actually, before I go to this slide, can I ask you all, how many of you here think that climate change is human-caused, so caused by humans? Okay, so overwhelming majority. But that's not the case when you actually talk to people on the street. So according to research, and most of this is pulled out from very authoritative research studies and reports done by a few different places. I can talk about them if you need later. But most people don't necessarily think that it's human-caused, and especially in those countries that are most affected by climate change. So we're seeing a lot of discrepancy in the perception of climate change around the world. We see, for example, that almost half of the world says that they've already experienced some kind of severe impact of climate change on their lives, yet in the most vulnerable countries like Nigeria, Haiti, Pakistan, and others, people say that they have little or no knowledge of climate change. So there's clearly a disconnect. We're seeing, for example, in India, that 77% of people think that the Indian government should be working more on climate action, yet, again, very few people, or not so many people, think that climate change is human-caused. So we're seeing a lot of sort of disparate opinions and awareness of this issue, which leads to a lack of understanding of how to make decisions on this very intractable challenge that we're facing as a globe. We're seeing that even if there's acknowledgement of the urgency, there's no agency. So we're seeing that people might acknowledge that climate change is happening, but that doesn't mean that it's being translated into sufficient policies. Another big challenge is that we're facing an uphill battle. These are some estimates that we were able to find. Likely the second one is quite conservative. We're probably seeing much higher numbers. So philanthropic funds really are not at the level that they need to be when it comes to influence tactics on climate change. And I think the opposition is definitely spending a lot more, sometimes to spread misinformation as well. So what we'll do as a foundation, we'll enable influencers on sort of different levels. So first of all, we will support journalism and journalists such as yourselves. We already support some newsrooms and we're gonna try to really focus on how they can add that urgency but also rigor in their climate change reporting. The second piece is we're a philanthropy, so we convene a lot of people around sort of a set of data and scientific evidence that's already there and make sure that they agree on what is on the paper so they can come together and make some decisions. And hopefully this will be also with policymakers, and we're already doing this with the G20 and G7 actually this year, and focusing on, of course, COP and other venues where climate change is being discussed at the highest levels. So we're going to kind of figure out what are those, so that they can figure out really what are those policies that work and what are those that don't. And then lastly, to Mitali's point from earlier, we're going to really focus on effective messengers of this issue, because we're seeing that trust is such an important piece of this conversation, like in every other issue, but this, especially this one. We actually saw this a lot during COVID when we as a foundation focused a lot on increasing vaccination and COVID testing around the world. And we saw that really the most effective ways to do this was when trusted messengers could, with that kind of authority, could talk to their communities about why this is important to them and why this needs to be changed. So in order to really change behaviors and policies, I think we need to go to those maybe unlikely stakeholders like faith leaders and others. And I'll talk a little bit about that as well later. But before I close, just on a different note, I wanted to share, so in the US, every 4 years, there's a climate change assessment, which is this sort of seminal report that gets delivered to the president and Congress. And this past one happened right before COP. COP is the UN climate conference in November. And it got a lot of coverage. And I think one way, because obviously it was not fun to read, but I think, and the report really talks about sort of environmental degradation, biodiversity, and of course climate change in general in the US and the state of it. But what was interesting about this one is that the first page was actually a poem, which was written by the US Poet Laureate, which is a very, obviously big acclaim. Her name is Ada Limon, and I just wanted to read a couple of lines from the poem. If you sit by the riverside, you see a culmination of all things upstream. We now know we were never at the circle center. Instead, all around us, something is living or trying to live. The world says, what we're becoming, we are becoming together. The world says, one type of dream has ended and another has just begun. The world says, once we were separate and now we must move in unison.
Thank you, Marina. I didn't know you were going to read that. That's beautiful.
Well, I'm full of surprises,
Well, I want to ask you about Rockefeller's commitment that you announced last year. Maybe you can unpack a little bit for this crowd. How, do you have specific examples of how media and journalism can augment ongoing policy initiatives? How does journalism fit into this larger conversation?
Yeah, we as a foundation definitely think about the sort of information ecosystem as more holistically, right? It's not just about journalism. I know everybody knows this in this room. But I think we're at a moment where it's really important that communications professionals work together. I think that is really, again, to your points about where the impact really ends up. I think it's really important that people understand we need to find those messages that are being absorbed and received by people in different places. So that means really being very intentional about the platforms and about how we're communicating about these issues. And so I think it's really important that, we're being intentional about it and not only center one approach and not another. So I think as part of that effort, we're actually starting an initiative I can share a little bit about in Indonesia, where we're hoping to develop messaging that's culturally sensitive for the Muslim community in Java that will then be complemented by sort of real-time monitoring of how these messages are being received by communities. And then we're also supporting a couple of newsrooms in the country to increase their access to very accurate climate reporting and then also training on climate change. So, and this could be kind of a pilot that we would then try to replicate in other geographies too. And Indonesia, of course, is a very sort of significant geopolitical actor when it comes to many different things, but also climate change in Asia. So, yeah, I think it's just about kind of thinking about this information ecosystem in a different way so that it's not just focusing on one set of players.
Thank you. Did you want to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to come in quickly on the point about impact assessment, Nina. And I think it's important because in our interactions with funders, it's often, this is great, we believe in it, but why? So I just want to answer the why a little bit for people who are looking at this from a funding lens. One is individual wins. That's something we track very closely with the cohorts we work with. So whether it's a cohort member from GMA Philippines who goes on and brings in a mandate for the newsroom to start thinking about climate, whether it is another reporter from the Congo who comes back to us and does a session around climate and conflict, which is so useful for our journalists, or whether it's collaborations where journalists from different parts of the world begin to team up together and report on stories that they think are important across geographies. The other one is group outcomes. That's something we monitor quite carefully. We have seen a change in terms of the confidence levels of our journalists while reporting about or talking about particular climate issues. And we think this is really important because that's something we've got as feedback. Part of the problem is that journalists don't talk about climate issues because they don't feel confident enough. When they have those tools in place, they can talk about it and they can counter any questions that they get around it. The other is safe spaces. It's no secret, we're in a community of journalists here. Many of us work in extremely difficult situations. Some of us are working in exile. Climate is no longer a climate story. It is most often an investigative story, whether it is the sand mafia in India or in parts of Latin America as well, where investigative journalism has really done some great work around climate. It's important to build spaces where journalists can voice their fears, where they can share their learning, and where they can really lean on each other for support. And the last bit that I will say in terms of impact assessment is two things. One, that what we're hearing back from our cohort members is newsrooms that go on to invest in climate are beginning to see that change. And I think this pushes back on the idea that, but no one's interested in climate. If you put in the resources that it requires, you will begin to see changes in it. And the last bit is around research. Our research shows that the public at a majority level across the countries we surveyed believe that journalism is the most effective tool for creating policy change. They're the ones that hold large industry accountable. They're the ones that hold governments accountable. And honestly, at the end of the day, if you want to see the dial moving, a large part of that push comes in from journalists and reportage that really holds power to accountability. That's where we want to see climate change or climate reportage making a difference. So, sometimes we get lost in the impact assessment conversation about, let's see the broad metrics, let's see the broad numbers. But it is about individual wins, and all the individual wins count up for something.
Thank you. So it's 12:32 as promised. I would get to your questions, but I'm actually going to steal the first question. This is a question for all three of you. So I want to talk about the framing of the climate story. We're balancing despair with optimism, but at the end of the day, we're all operating with a certain level of uncertainty. So when you think about what's missing from the conversation about climate change, what stands out?
Well, I can just start, but this is just one thought. But and Mitali just actually kind of reminded me of this point. But I think it's silly to talk about climate change as a very isolated thing, because it isn't. It's very much. It intersects with all of what we live through every day, right? So, and I think what we're seeing as in general, this always happens. We were talking about this earlier. It's like the climate change community is separate from the public health community. It's separate from the food security community. It's separate from whatever other energy even sometimes, which is hilarious. So I think it's really important that as journalists, but also generally comms professionals, to my other point, it's important that we connect those things, because I think that's how you really reach people, because where they are. Because again, if you're talking about a weather disaster, most often nowadays it's caused by something that has to do with climate change. So I think it's important to connect those things so that it doesn't end up being this wonky thing, and that it doesn't end up being so politicized, which is what we're seeing so much in many places. So I think the more we can depoliticize and really focus on the science of it all and sort of try to back it with evidence that is hard to oppose, I think the better we are. And especially then finding ways to connect it to those things that really affect people on the ground. Because yes, if you ask somebody on the ground, do they know about climate change? They might not know. But if you explain to them, well, it has to do with the crops that you are trying to, then it's a different story. So I think it's our duty to make those connections.
And I've just seen an evolution over the last 10 years. Even 5 years ago, if you were doing climate journalism, it was called advocacy journalism. Now it's just science journalism, which is a positive step. You have, former governor of California and action star Arnold Schwarzenegger out there talking about climate, but in very different ways. He talks about it as pollution. That's the driver. Senator Lisa Murkowski from Alaska, who's a Republican, she and her constituency, they are experiencing it. So even on the right, you see that movement. So I think that's positive. I would like to see that. I think it is becoming mainstream. So maybe it's not something that's missing. Maybe it's something that needs to happen faster.
I would say two things. I think one bottleneck that I've mentioned before is the fact that there doesn't seem to be enough will at the senior level in newsrooms, and I think that needs to change. It's not just about the story metrics, it's about the fact that climate needs to be inserted into every story, and we're not seeing that enough, honestly. You do get a lot of interest around extreme weather events, but it tends to be seen as a separate, a separate section. Someone sort of laughingly asked me at one of these discussions, oh, but is a weather person a climate person? Well, hell yes. I mean, what else, right? He's the one or she's the one who's reporting on extreme weather events as they happen. What do you think their mandate is? And I would say, I feel like I've lost my train of thought, but I will say that I think it's important to make stories quite localized. On this point about audiences in India, for example, what we polled and found was that when we asked the audiences, do you think climate change is affecting you now? They said they see an effect of it 10 years from now. But when we asked them if they saw a connection between climate change and health, it was an overwhelming yes for them and their families. It is a truth that in global south countries, most populations are disproportionately affected by the impact of climate change, whether it's through air pollution or whether it's through, a journalist in Pakistan, when they had those terrible floods, I was speaking to him and he said, well, you know what, I can't remember in the last 8 years, a year where we didn't have terrible floods. It's only because it's been so bad this year that there's global attention. This leads to other health outcomes. So I think it's important to become really localized, and that can only happen when you spread the information and you spread the access to data.
And you also mentioned solutions journalism, which is a really critical piece of this conversation. Questions?
Oh boy.
Oh boy.
We're sorry in advance.
Do we have a mic runner? Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for your excellent talks. You all talked about science. It is science journalism. I would say it is not enough to say that it is science journalism, because it is science journalism with other kind of journalism. It is about foreign affairs, it is about economics, and so on. Which is the role of scientific organizations in your programs and in your initiatives? I was impressed by the sentence, there is a lack of data. Actually, we have a lot of data available. I'm working for a science organization in climate change, a research organization in climate change, and there is also an increased ability in producing climate data on demand. So, my question for all of you is, which is the role of a science organization in your programs? Thank you very much.
I was going to say, I can go first because we only fund journalism directly. So we don't get in the middle of sourcing.
We support a lot of science organizations. That's kind of our theory of philanthropy, actually, has always been, since its inception, honestly, has been that it's a scientific philanthropy. So I don't even know where to start, but basically all of our programs work with all of the sort of authoritative organizations when it comes to whatever they're working on. So I mean, just an example with health, it's, you know, WHO, we're always present at the like World Health Assembly and others, other big gatherings of that size. So I don't, you know, and I think for us specifically, we're also trying to see how science organizations, for me specifically, I guess from my vantage point of view, I guess we're looking at how scientific organizations are thinking about information, right, and how they think about their communication. So one effort is actually with the National Academies of Science in the US. They have a very interesting program that really works on influencing how film and TV directors and writers are looking at scientific plots, right, and plot lines and narratives. So we're actually, we had a meeting with them talking about how they do that for climate change, for example. So yeah, we do it on different levels.
I will say quickly, it's not that there isn't data, there is a lack of access to data, and there is a lack of being able to interpret the data, and I think they're two different things. One of the things that we did at the Oxford Climate Network, and a shout out to my team members, Diego Arguedas-Ortiz and Catherine Dunn, who both run this program so successfully, is that we started something called the Global South Climate Database. It is an open database where we are taking in applications from climate experts across the world. You can register, you can tell us what your area of expertise is, and you can also tell us what the languages are that you speak. This immediately opens up the process where someone sitting in Congo or someone sitting in Nigeria wants an expert who understands the cultural and community context of a problem in Nigeria. They can go into the database, find the 6 or 10 or 12 experts who not just speak to that topic, but perhaps speak a language other than English, and they can tap into that resource to get more information. So I'm completely with you. There's a wealth of data out there, but it has to reach a larger space.
Yeah, and I can just add really quickly, I think it's also that, unfortunately, it doesn't mean that that data ever really gets necessarily translated into the kind of policies that we're trying to see, right? So, I worked a lot on gender equality, and I mean, there's so many reports about women empowerment and women's rights and blah, 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 and, still, this is where we are. So, it's just, you can see it across the board, unfortunately, and climate change is definitely one of them as well.
Hi. Question for Robert and Marina. How do you approach and work with organizations that publish content not in English, in other languages?
We used to have a Spanish program for all of our articles that we publish natively. So we have shifted, and now we work with larger partners. So, the AP, New York Times, all those folks, we trust them to do that. Like I said, we just fund the programs. Do you have a more?
I think this is something that we're actually thinking through right now, especially as we're really working towards getting into those regions of the world that are most affected by this. We have offices we have 2 regional offices in Africa and in Asia that already do a lot of this kind of, they already support some of this work, but I think there's more to be done. So hopefully we'll get there.
Hi, I'm Patricia from Horipec Trust, a UK charity that supports freelance journalists. And I wanted to ask you about safety of climate journalists. As you mentioned before, we were related safety with conflict, but now we also think about the safety of environmental journalists. So how do you approach that from a funder's perspective? What do you want editors and managers to do in terms of risk assessment, for example? Thanks.
Sure, I can take that. Not a funder, but we try to create as many safe spaces, and I completely agree with you. It is a huge problem. We try to create spaces where there are smaller, more intimate chats in terms of what kind of support they need, what kind of options they have. Honestly, when you look at legal harassment as well, because that's a huge tool when talking about climate stories, it's so easy to slap a suit against that particular organization and say, hey, that's not a legitimate story. That's what we're trying to do. I'm not saying it's enough, but we are trying to build those communities. And one thing we've only just started is that we got a lot of feedback from within our cohorts for the need for smaller networks of freelance journalists. And that's what we're trying to pilot out, where these journalists then form smaller nucleuses where they're speaking to each other, where they're supporting each other on stories. Because honestly, the idea is not to sort of build this network and then build walls around it. We want to see some kind of effect that rolls on from there. So in many countries, especially across the African continent, we've seen journalists be part of the program, go back and then start little mini chapters of their own, where they start reaching out to the community of journalists in that country to support each other or just to sort of share more climate information. And I know it's happening in parts of Europe as well.
Up in the front here.
Thank you. It was a really great presentation. My question for Robert and Marina, and I think it's related to the impact. Do you consider when you are looking for a story with an impact before funding these stories or just trying to evaluate them, do you consider the political and geographical context, saying that countries with authoritarian systems, they ignore any findings of the investigations, not to say that the journalists will end detained or even threatened. So it's really that there is an impact, only it is that the publishing, that telling the story for the public, this is usually the impact. I'm from Jordan, I'm from the Middle East, I know what I'm talking about. So I found that it's rarely addressed, the political context, when we are evaluating the impacts of the story that funders are looking for before funding these stories. Do you consider this kind of, considering this political context?
Yeah, I mean, you have to. I think we haven't run into so many of these issues just because of the types of funding that we've been doing. But I think it's, especially in working in, I'll just say Asia, in specific countries, I think it's become harder and harder for journalists to see it. Even if they want to follow through on that impact, it's hard to do so. So the story, if it even comes out, the story itself, it's already a big impact, right? It's already a big success that it happened. So I agree with you. I think I will say, though, that we as funders also have a responsibility to show for that impact often because of our, even legal requirements. So we need to see how the funds are being spent in that way. And so I think it's about finding ways that keep the journalists safe, but also go beyond the sort of traditional readership metrics, how many eyeballs were on the article. I think there's other ways we can think through keeping in mind all those safety considerations.
I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you for opportunity for last questions. My name is Emin Husseinov. I'm exile-based journalist from Azerbaijan, which is this year supposed to host COP29. And I'm not super active climate journalist. I'm mostly oriented for human rights, exposing corruptions, writing about rule of law. But COP29 make serious problem for all civil society and independent journalism in Azerbaijan. Literally after November, when our authoritarian ruler able to took this opportunity in Dubai, he started to arrest all independent voices. Right now, they're destroyed completely. Civil society in Azerbaijan. Most of climate journalists, climate defenders, traditional journalists arrested. We have 300 political prisoners. My question is to your network, because we didn't see many attentions to such kind of problem, which has generated the biggest climate change conferences, which is 75,000 participants supposed to come to Azerbaijan for 2 weeks, and after Azerbaijan supposed to be president of the COP29 until COP30 in Rio. Why nobody interested to write about rule of law together with climate justice? When we see some climate journalists writing articles, they don't looking forward on situation with the human rights, with the situation with the democracy, with the situation with rule of law, because without this, we don't believe it's possible to do any serious climate changes for all our planet. Thank you.
I hear you. I don't know how long I have for an answer, but I completely hear you. Sometimes it's a slow burn. That's the lame answer, which is that it starts building up closer to event. But I will say that some reportage has begun already. The moment the Council of Experts was constituted for the COP conference in Azerbaijan, I think a few newsrooms pointed out there was 0 women. 0. And they happen to be more affected by climate change, by migration, by all of it. I think there was some pushback which caused the government to reassess who they would like to have as the expert panel. That was one change. And I think I would just draw back to experiences from COP in Dubai and lessons from there. I think the reason there was a lot of critical questions asked about the role of energy companies and such large energy dependent countries hosting the COP really held the entire conference to greater accountability. There was far more nuance in terms of the reportage and what was being signed off and why. And I would hope that the same would happen for Azerbaijan, and it would take into consideration the very real challenges that you have in terms of, the freedom of speech, really, against the backdrop of climate as well.
I think that's all the time we have. Thank you so much, Mitali, Rob, Marina. Thank you for joining us.